Good morning. My name is Janet Heine Barnett, and it's my pleasure this morning to welcome you to MathFest 2023 on behalf of all of the individuals who have put so much time and work and effort into making the wonderful program that's ahead of us. We should thank them. I've been super excited, especially about the really rich offerings in the history of mathematics that are in this year's program. And I'm delighted that we get to actually start tasting those offerings right off the bat with this morning's invited AMS-MAA joint address by Dr. Sloan Evans Despeaux. So Dr. Despeaux completed her doctorate in the history of mathematics in the very highly selective and demanding program that's directed by Karen Parshall at the University of Virginia. Sloan's research centers on the mathematics, mathematicians, and scientific journals of 19th-century Britain, and more recently on early 20th century America, which we'll hear about today. Since 2002, Dr. Despeaux has taught in the mathematics program at Western Carolina University, where she's won several teaching awards, as well as the university's Hunter Scholar Award. She's also contributed in various editorial and other capacities to the profession in ways way too numerous for us to list today. But I think most importantly, the thing to know about Sloan is whether it's her teaching, her service, or her research, she is one of the most collegial, warm, and welcoming individuals that you could ever hope to work with. So her topic this morning, Oswald Veblen, Success Through Collaboration, is especially fitting. Please join me in welcoming Sloan to the podium.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks for all of you joining me in this very big room. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. Thanks for the folks in the back who got me all wired up and ready to go so you can hear me. So today I'd like to talk about Oswald Veblen and collaboration, both the collaborative efforts that Veblen was a part of during his lifetime and the collaborative effort by historians of mathematics to study him. A few years after his death in 1960, two accounts of Veblen's life appeared. One by Saunders Maclean, who described Veblen as, quote, a geometer and mathematical statesman, and one by Dean Montgomery, who called Veblen, quote, one of the most influential mathematicians of this century. Based on these two accounts, I'm going to first give you a brief sketch of Veblen's life. So Oswald was the first of 8 children. At the time of his birth, his father was teaching mathematics at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. After graduate work at Johns Hopkins, Veblen's father would later become professor of physics at the University of Iowa. Maclean described Oswald's uncle, Thorstein Veblen, as a, quote, brilliant but maverick economist and social theorist. Oswald earned his first bachelor's degree at the University of Iowa in 1898, to be followed 2 years later by a second bachelor's degree at Harvard. He then moved on to the University of Chicago, where he completed a Ph.D. in mathematics under the direction of E.H. Moore. His thesis was on the foundations of geometry. After graduation, he stayed on at Chicago for a couple of years as an associate of mathematics. In this role, he directed R.L. Moore's Ph.D. thesis and collaborated with the Scottish mathematician Joseph Wedderburn. In 1905, Veblen joined Princeton's mathematics faculty as a preceptor, a new position for junior faculty created to improve the quality of undergraduate education there. A few years into this job, he met Elizabeth Richardson, who was visiting her brother Owen, a physicist then at Princeton. Owen would go on to win a Nobel Prize in physics, as did Elizabeth's sister's husband, Clinton Davidson. Elizabeth was English, and the couple often traveled to Europe. For example, on an exchange professorship to Oxford in 1928, he exchanged with G.H. Hardy, and on a lecture tour of Berlin, Hamburg, and Göttingen in 1932. Of Veblen's mathematical contributions, Montgomery wrote that, quote, almost all of his work was connected with geometry, and in all of it, he was greatly concerned with precision and completeness. He had the ability to see the foundations in a clear and relevant way without wandering into ramifications beyond the requirements of mathematics. MacLean, for his part, wrote that Veblen was a geometer with an especial interest in the foundations and with a particular flair for picking out and developing the important ideas which he found rough-hewn in the literature. Out of the 71 entries in Montgomery's bibliography of Veblen, we can notice that 21 of them had co-authors. The first page, and there's your second. So let's look at some of the entries on this bibliography. So Veblen collaborated with John Wesley Young on a 2-volume series on projective geometry that MacLean deemed a model for its elegance, completeness, and clarity. Of Veblen's collected works, MacLean considered Veblen's volume Analysis Situs his most influential that encouraged innovations on the subject. MacLean wrote that with these changes, Analysis Situs has been renamed first combinatorial topology and then algebraic topology. So by now, Veblen's expressed wish that his book would soon become obsolete has belatedly been fulfilled, thanks in substantial part to the very influence of this book. During World War I, Veblen left Princeton for the Aberdeen Proving Ground, where he was first captain and then major in the Army's Ordnance Department. MacLean tells us, though his work was largely experimental and administrative, he succeeded in bringing 8 or 9 other mathematicians into the analytical work of the organization. After the war, Veblen returned to Princeton, where we're told he was instrumental in building up both the mathematics department faculty and the facilities for mathematicians. Montgomery writes that during Veblen's presidency of the American Mathematical Society from 1923 to 1924, the society was in a financial crisis, and Veblen was very effective in helping to meet this crisis and to establish an endowment fund. From Princeton, Veblen took on an important advisory role at the newly established Institute for Advanced Study. MacLean wrote that Veblen was called on more and more to provide advice, guidance, and encouragement to the young mathematicians who flocked there. He also played an important role for young mathematicians when he helped establish postdoctoral fellowships at the National Research Council. Montgomery and MacLean recount that after Hitler's rise to power in Germany, Veblen helped relocate refugee mathematicians from Europe to the U.S. He played a foundational role in the establishment of mathematical reviews and was again at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where he again brought mathematicians together, notably John von Neumann. In 1950, the year he was made emeritus professor at Princeton, Veblen was honored with the presidency of the International Mathematical Congress held at Harvard. And there ends the main points in the accounts of MacLean and Montgomery. So hopefully this gives you a sense for how interesting and multifaceted Veblen's career was, but hopefully it also leaves you with a sense that there's much more to the history. In recent years, several articles have appeared about aspects of Veblen's life which fill in some of the holes left by McLean and Montgomery. For example, David Allen Greer has written on Veblen's service during World War I. Lauren Butler Pfeffer has considered Veblen's role in raising money for mathematics research. And Steve Batterson has given an overview of Veblen's influence as, quote, a mathematician, mentor, and advocate. Veblen has also appeared in Karen Parshall and David Rowe's volume on the emergence of the American mathematical research community, and he featured prominently in Parshall's recent volume on American mathematics from 1920 to 1950. Veblen also features in Batterson's volume on the Institute for Advanced Study and on American mathematics from 1890 to 1913. While recent scholarship has given valuable additions to our understanding of Veblen's life and contributions to mathematics, there's plenty of room for more scholarship on this multifaceted mathematician. Last December, Della Dumbaugh, Gemma Lorenat, and I proposed a one-week workshop at Oberwolfach to begin painting what we called a composite portrait of Veblen. We invited historians of mathematics and mathematicians from the US and Europe, as well as a historian of economics and a philosopher of mathematics. As a starting place, we had participants read the existing scholarship that I've outlined for you. We also provided the group with digital scans of hundreds of manuscripts from the Veblen papers housed at the Library of Congress. Unlike other small week-long conferences on the history of mathematics, our workshop was not a showcase for finished research. We did not sit through hours and hours of talks each day. Instead, each day began with a couple of prearranged talks. For example, Steve Kennedy gave us a general introduction to Veblen's life. Deborah Kent gave an overview of mathematics in the US before Veblen. Laura Turner about the cultural value of mathematics in the US during the 1920s. And Emmylou Hafner gave us a talk on working with private manuscripts, like notebooks or drafts. Some participants organized spur-of-the-moment talks during the meeting. Talks based on, well, not spur of the moment, we would give them one night to prepare. So not quite that spur of the moment, but still not a whole lot of time to prepare. And these were talks that were based on previous work that intersected what we found in the archives. So for example, Chris Hollings gave a talk based on his volume with Reinhard Sigmund Schulze on the International Congress of Mathematicians held in Oslo in 1936. A meeting where Veblen gave a plenary address. Erica Luciano, and this is a slide from her talk, talked about her forthcoming book on the Jewish mathematical diaspora from fascist Italy and Veblen's role in helping these refugees obtain academic appointments in the US. Our workshop participants formed 5 working groups, each surrounding some aspect of Veblen's career. After our morning talks, each group found a corner of the Institute to work in for the rest of the day. The campus at Oberwolfach provided our groups beautiful spaces. The picture with the window is where my group was working. A wonderful library whose librarians had pre-pulled texts for us that they thought we might need. And of course, ample coffee and cakes. And this is really interesting because in his own work surrounding the construction of Fine Hall at Princeton and Fuld Hall at the Institute for Advanced Study, Veblen had also considered these very same amenities for scholars. So each evening, our groups would gather back together to report on the day's progress, roadblocks, and discoveries. As the week progressed, Each group refined their topics, framed new questions, and made plans for next steps. So while the work of all 5 groups is still in progress, this talk has a big asterisk next to it, okay? This is work in progress. I'd still like to give you a sense of what each group is doing, and that's what I'm going to do now. Emmylou Hafner, Gemma Lorenat, Nicolas Michel, and Denise Sarakaya began their investigations with this notebook. It contains Veblen's notes on E.H. Moore's lectures on the foundations of geometry, lectures that Veblen attended as a graduate student at the University of Chicago in the fall of 1901. This 45-page notebook contains not only lecture notes written on the right side, but additional notes that Veblen added later in pen on the left. The group soon realized that some of Veblen's notes here are directly related to results that would later appear in his dissertation. Their project is a critical transcription of the notebook with a commentary that will highlight links between the original sources assigned by E.H. Moore for the seminar and Veblen's, as well as other seminar participants' later publications. Moore's seminar drew mainly from 5 contemporary works: Hilbert's 1899 Grundlagen der Geometrie, Pasch's 1882 Vorlesungen über neuere Geometrie, Peano's 1894 paper Sui fondamenti della geometria, although here listed, Veblen listed a different Peano reference in the notebook. The team's comparisons have found the actual source, Ingrami's Elementi di Geometria, and Schur's 1901 paper Über die Grundlagen der Geometrie. An example of how Veblen incorporated what he learned from the seminar's reading and lectures appears as this Theorem 5. An earlier version appeared as a glued-in note in the notebook. This second version is made in pen on the left side of the notebook, which indicates that he added it later. You can also see on this page that Veblen noted that the theorem was, quote, stated in language suggested by Professor Moore's remarks. So the group compared Veblen's Theorem 5 to Satz 5 in section 4 of Hilbert's Grundlagen. And then they compared Veblen's Theorem 5 to Theorem 26 in his later dissertation. We already saw earlier in this talk about how many of Veblen's publications were co-authored. This notebook under study by the group, as well as later published articles, such as the 1905 article by Veblen on Jordan's closed curve theorem, give evidence of the power of less formal collaborative research experiences in Veblen's life. Besides the mentorship provided to Veblen as a student, the group also plans to investigate Veblen's early mentoring activities, such as the seminars he organized at Chicago after his graduation, given to students sometimes just a little bit younger than he was. "40 minutes is a long time for a talk. Whew. Okay. All right, let's go. All right. Veblen's tendencies towards collaboration only deepened during his World War I experience at Aberdeen Proving Ground, as Jim Ritter has pointed out in his 2011 article on Veblen and Princeton geometry and physics. The working group, consisting of Caroline Earhart, Laura Turner, and Helena Dernova, are investigating how Veblen's World War I involvement may have been instrumental upon his return to Princeton University. This is part of their wider goal of writing a social and cultural history of mathematics at Princeton during Veblen's years there from 1905 until he joined the Institute for Advanced Study in 1932. Among other directions, they are exploring what mathematics Veblen and his colleagues considered relevant and to which European mathematical centers they turned for inspiration, both for research topics and the culture of research. They are particularly interested in the correspondence between Veblen and Henry Fine, starting in 1905 when Veblen was a newly appointed preceptor at Princeton and Fine was dean of the faculty. The group will also look into what types of mathematics were developed and taught at Princeton by reviewing Princeton's course offerings during Veblen's tenure. They'll also review the periodicals of Princeton, including the Daily Princetonian, here announcing Veblen's talk to the Math Club, and the Princeton University Weekly Bulletin. The team will investigate the role of Princeton's Math Club, which was aimed at graduate students rather than undergrads, and Veblen's connections to it. The group will also investigate Veblen's role in bringing to life the image often associated with Princeton mathematical culture, afternoon tea at Fine Hall. During his time at Princeton, Veblen served as AMS president. My working group, with Ben Braun and Samson Durand, used Veblen's 1923 to 24 term as AMS president as a starting point for our investigations. Looking through the scanned manuscripts from the Veblen papers that we had at our disposal, we got interested in Veblen's support system. So by the 1920s, Veblen had taken on more and more leadership roles in mathematics, and those roles came with support staff. Who were these people, and how did they get into their positions? One especially interesting staffer was Carolyn Seeley, who had advanced training in mathematics. The more our group learned about her, the more we realized how extraordinary she was, taking a unique path for an early 20th century female mathematician. While our investigation of Seeley is not directly about Veblen, the workshop's wonderfully open format encouraged us to go down this road, to pursue this interesting direction that was full of interesting questions. Seeley pursued her undergraduate studies at Barnard, a women's college coordinated with Columbia. In fact, the male faculty of Columbia taught the courses at Barnard, unlike the case with other women's colleges. According to Green and LeDuc's Pioneering Women, only 3 of Barnard's pre-1940 graduates went on to get a mathematics Ph.D. One was Seeley, who completed her Ph.D. at Columbia in 1914, and the other 2 completed their Ph.D.s decades later in the 1930s. So from the start of her mathematical career, Seeley was truly blazing her own path. During her graduate studies, she worked with David Eugene Smith at Columbia as a graduate assistant. We were able to get some scans from the D.E. Smith archive at Columbia. In this September 1913 letter to Smith, Seeley tells him how much she's enjoyed the job and that she's, quote, rather jealous of Miss Kugler for taking her place. Seeley was leaving this job to begin what would become a 22-year tenure at the American Mathematical Society, serving as the first mathematician with full-time employment at the society. So I had remembered somewhere in the back of my mind that Jim Tattersall had given a talk about Seeley at the joint math meetings some years ago. And I emailed him from Oberwolfach to tell him about what our group was doing, to see what he was doing. Jim truly belongs in any talk about collaboration, since he has always been incredibly generous about sharing his painstaking and careful research with me. So sure enough, Jim and Sean McMurrin were working on an article about Seeley, which is hot off the presses. in the notices of the AMS. And true to form, they have generously shared their manuscript scans and their notes with us. We also found interesting work done by Ellen Abrams. Her chapter is also hot off the presses in Women in the History of Science, a source book. Ellen shared this picture of Seeley that was shared with her by Seeley's great niece. So, first off, what did Seeley do in her role at the Society? So we can start to understand that through this memorandum. So the context around it was 1921, there was some talk about restructuring the roles at the AMS, and the AMS Secretary Richardson compiled this list of Seeley's duties. Page 1, page 2. Keep in mind, these are only the duties under the Secretary's purview. Seeley also assisted the bulletin editor, Earl Raymond Hedrick, in reading proofs, collecting material for the notes section of the journal, and for the list of new publications, receiving and sending out books for review, correcting the mailing list, collecting material for the annual list of published papers, and preparing the bulletin's index. By this time, Seeley had been in the job since 1913, and in this job, her duties had successively grown. Jim and Sean's examination of the AMS archives provide a rich behind-the-scenes view of Seeley's working life there. It's also interesting to see what was actually printed about Seeley in the AMS publications. So you can see in 1916, the Bulletin published her translation of the testament that established the Mittag-Leffler Institute. The treasurer reports of the Bulletin list Seeley's salary each year up to 1929. I gave you a couple of examples. Here, Seeley first appears on the title page of the Bulletin in 1925, along with the other assistant editors. Seeley here is mentioned by Raymond Clare Archibald in the foreword to the catalog of the AMS library. Samson-Durand from our group has carefully studied AMS publications in his earlier research, and he's been able to track Seeley's participation in AMS meetings. So from 1914 to 1935, she's listed in the Bulletin as having participated in 74 AMS meetings, not too shabby. And Samson, and also in the Bulletin, you can see that at the 1927 AMS meeting at Columbia, her paper on kernels was read. The Bulletin's list of published papers also records Seeley's published research activity, starting with her dissertation in 1915 to a series of 3 papers on kernels published in the Annals of Mathematics. And this is her 4th article, which was published directly in the Bulletin in 1931. So published mathematical papers that were listed in the Bulletin formed the core of what Richardson called a research paper in his 1936 study on mathematical research. In their own study, Green and Leduc separated out the women in Richardson's table. So you can see that Seeley was part of a very small group of women publishing regularly in these outlets. Our working group will focus in on Seeley's research and examine the extent to which her position at the AMS helped her stay active in her mathematical research. Seeley was unusual in other ways. She was one of only 6 women involved in AMS journals and governance from 1900 to 1950. Of the 228 pre-1940s women American mathematics Ph.D. holders examined by Green and LeDuc, Seeley was one of only 19 whose main employment was non-academic. Of these 19, she was the only one not employed by a business or a government entity. In 1935, when Veblen, who was 7 years older than Seeley, was just at the beginning of his tenure at the Institute for Advanced Study, Seeley was ready to retire. In a letter to D.E. Smith, Seeley wrote that she was going to officially retire from the AMS on April Fool's Day to start a chicken farm near Ithaca, New York, which she did. While those at the AMS tried to talk her out of it, she was steadfast in her decision. Our working group would like to look more deeply into the factors that motivated Seeley's decision. After Seeley's departure, the AMS decided to hire 2 people in her place. One was Evelyn Hull, who acted as an office manager, and another was Alta Odoms, who functioned as an editorial assistant. Odoms earned her Ph.D. a year in mathematics, a year into this job, and she also resigned effective April Fool's Day, this time in 1937. Her successor, Mildred Sullivan, only lasted a year in the job. So another question we want to explore is why Seeley's path was not replicated and what conditions contributed to the brevity of the terms of Odoms and Sullivan. As Seeley was leaving her mathematical career, and about a decade after his tenure as president of the AMS, Veblen would put his team-building talent to use in building the School of Mathematics at the Institute for Advanced Study. At our workshop, Della Dunbar and Juan Carvajalino focused on the correspondence between Veblen and Abraham Flexner, director of the Institute from its birth in 1930 throughout the decade. Flexner acknowledged that Veblen was central to recruiting the faculty for the School of Mathematics. Initially, Albert Einstein, Hermann Weyl, James Alexander, and John von Neumann. In his January 28, 1935 letter to Veblen, Flexner wrote that Veblen was, quote, the real founder of the School of Mathematics. However, there was considerable tension between Flexner and Veblen regarding building the physical structure where the mathematics faculty and the rest of the institute would work, the rest of the faculty in the institute would work. In Veblen's view, the institute should be a visible and independent seat of learning. He advocated for situating the institute on a large plot of land with a residential center like Oxford, but without the monastic background. Flexner, on the other hand, wanted to proceed more cautiously, writing that every dollar invested in real estate diminishes income, and making the point that it is men and facilities that make institutions of learning, not acres or frontage. Della and Juan are also looking at the Veblen-von Neumann correspondence during the 1930s as a case study into Veblen's practices as director of the School of Mathematics. They've written that this correspondence, quote, highlights the personal, social, political, and scientific aspects of the activities that linked their otherwise personal and professional lives. Taken together, they show that the uniting of these seemingly different spheres played a key role in creating the community of mathematicians at the Institute, both in its very early stages and when the growing number of scholars at the Institute came to inhabit the same working space in 1939 in Fold Hall. 8 years later, Life magazine called the Institute a, quote, haven, and included Veblen in its multi-page spread alongside Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer. 6 years after the life spread celebrating the Institute, Veblen authored this statement. In it, he denies being a communist, saying instead that he is, quote, an individualist of the old-fashioned American type that grew up in the 19th century. He then outlined 4 instances where his mathematical career had been interrupted. World War I service at the age of 39, finding academic positions for refugees fleeing Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, World War II service at the age of 61, and finally, finding academic posts for political refugees after the war. Both the circumstances surrounding this statement and the list given in the statement have provided the impetus for our last working group, composed of David Aubin, Chris Hollings, Steve Kennedy, Deborah Kent, and Erica Luciano, who are investigating Veblen's informal scientific diplomacy. While this group still has many more documents and manuscripts to consult, they've discovered some of the context that might have prompted Veblen to make this statement. In this letter addressed to Veblen, Alfred Kohlberg, a textile importer close to Senator Joe McCarthy, wrote that Veblen was a signer on a letter to congressional candidates from the National Committee to Repeal the McCarran Act, an act which was enacted in 1950 in response to anti-communist fears and which was nicknamed by its critics the concentration camp law. Kohlberg pointed out that many of the signatories of the letter from the National Committee were communists or fellow travelers, and asked Veblen whether you consider that your motivations at this time, when Americans are dying in a shooting war with communism, is none of the public's business. Besides the circumstances surrounding it, Veblen's list outlines 4 episodes where he both developed and utilized informal networks. The working group got a flavor for how these informal networks formed through surviving correspondence between Veblen and G.H. Hardy, Bertrand Russell, and Hermann Weyl. This correspondence is only a fraction of the communication that made Veblen from 1933 onwards, quote, the nexus of a web of personal connections providing aid to distressed mathematicians. The group notes, interestingly, that this aid was not given from an official position, but was instead the result of his knowledge of the community and his extensive personal relationships. The institution man was, paradoxically, a hyper-individualistic giver of succor. The brief biographical details I gave at the beginning of this talk gave only a sketch of Veblen's life and contributions to mathematics. Hopefully, this talk has shown that Veblen deserves much more than a sketch. The workshop's title, Towards a Composite Portrait of Oswald Veblen, captures our group's wish that together with recent scholarship, we can use many brushes to paint a richer picture of Veblen, a person who used collaboration to help further mathematics and the profession, institutions, and people surrounding it. Thank you very much. Can you go back to the slide? I've got one more slide. Aren't these pictures great? Yeah, they're really great. The Institute for Advanced Study shared a lot of these with me, and those didn't fit, so I just wanted you to see them.
There is time for questions, and there's a microphone here in the center of the room if you do have questions. While we're waiting for somebody to come to the microphone. That's not too intimidating. Yeah, right. Victor, do you want to stand at the mic?
Well, thanks very much, first of all. I'm interested. I had no idea that Veblen would have been someone who would have been suspected of communist activities or something. Can you say some more about that?
So Dirk Strook was accused of having plotted to blow up the White House. And Veblen was involved with his defense. Okay, and this is all from the archive. He wrote a letter to Truman asking to commute the death sentence of the Rosenbergs to life imprisonment. He was also in support and sympathetic to various foreign causes, such as the rights for citizens born abroad, but he was careful to not be formally involved in them. So those are just the documents so far that group has seen in that folder. Victor was not a plant. I just thought somebody would ask, and I wrote notes. But thank you for asking that question.
We should ask her what other notes she has, because she's anticipated these questions, right? I am curious about when we might start to see some of the work coming out from these. No idea.
Okay. It's very much still in progress.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very good. We have another question. Oh, maybe two.
What were the backgrounds of the people doing this research? Did they all have similar backgrounds or different backgrounds?
Let's see. Let me go back. Oh, that's all. You should never do this. Never do this if you give a PowerPoint. Never do this. Never do this. This is not good. This is not best practices. Don't do it. I always tell my students, never do this. But I want you to see the picture. Okay. All right. So let's see. So we have historians of math, and then we have Ben Braun, mathematician. Juan Carvalhino is a historian of economics. So Ben's in the middle crouching. Juan is on the right next to him, and on the right next to Juan is Denise, and he's a philosopher of mathematics. The rest of the group are historians of math. So anyway, and from all over, so we had some folks from France, Germany, Canada, U.S., yeah, Switzerland, yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Point again, but going all the way back to the end.
to the end. Okay.
But the last, basically the last slide you had before the final pictures, I just wanted to know more about. Almost there.
It's a lot of slides.
It's good stuff. That.
Oops. That one?
Yeah, I just that summary. I read that, and I just wanted to know more.
So I guess that the group is, what the group is talking about is, he helped refugees twice, right? So he helped refugees fleeing Hitler's Germany, fascist Italy, and then after World War II, he helped mathematicians who wanted to flee because of the Cold War, right? And he is very institutionally linked. He's an institution man, but the way he did all of this was it was a letter to a friend and then another letter to a friend. It was very high-touch, individualistic, not like it wasn't through official channels. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little comment that Saunders McLean made when he taught courses on history of topology. he pointed out that Princeton was uniquely welcoming to people from Europe, whereas one of the other mathematical centers, namely Harvard, was very much against that. And he alluded that some of this had to do with anti-Semitism.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I should say McLean had been a faculty member at Harvard around that time.
Yes. Well, and definitely, I think I'm really fascinated, and I'm not the only one in our group who's fascinated with Elizabeth Richardson Veblen's role. You know, she was English, and you know, she wanted to go home sometime, right? So Veblen would go to the UK, and then he did a lot of touring through Europe as well. And I think that when you travel, it really helps to open your mind internationally and just be more welcoming. So there's more to be done. I'd really like to see what Elizabeth's role was in that.
Yes, well, thank you again for such a lovely talk. I was struck by the spread in Life magazine in 1947 about the thinkers. Do you have any sense of what, I mean, it's interesting to try to imagine what a comparable publication
today
now would be and how it might, if such a publication exists, and how it might handle this topic. I mean, this is kind of amazing, an amazing mass market publication that was in many homes. Do you have any sense of why Life chose to publish this, and also of what the reaction or impact was? I realize those are very hard things to measure, but
it does kind of blow your mind, right? That Life magazine would have a mathematician in a spread, right? And it was probably 20 pages long, and it had photos of all of the scholars at the Institute. So it was like an archaeologist, an economist, action shots, but they're all just kind of standing around, I mean. It did have one guy like leaning back on a sofa thinking, and it was really, I agree. I thought this was fascinating, and you can get it on Google Books, you can read it yourself. It's a really fascinating article to think about. Today, would that ever happen? And that's not the only Life spread, because the one with the dog with von Neumann. Oh no, that's no. The dog's name is Inverse. Yeah. That comes from another Life spread, multi-page spread on von Neumann after his death. Multi-page, multi-picture in Life magazine. And when Veblen was trying to fundraise in the 20s, he did a big push to get mathematics in the popular press. That was part of the one of the arms of the fundraising, and just sort of bringing mathematics to the public. So anyway, I mean, in the Life spread with Veblen, though, you also had, you had Einstein, you had Oppenheimer, and, that was very, very interesting to the public as well, so.
Okay, no, thank you very much. I mean, I guess they might have been celebrating the Institute partly because, they were, this was another part of America's thanks to the people who developed the atomic bomb. I mean, with Oppenheimer showing in all the theaters, it's hard not to speculate that there's some connection.
I really wanted to put in a Barbie slide, but I didn't.
I'm wearing my Barbie colors today.
So before we close, I wanted to mention that Sloan has also organized an invited paper session on this same topic. Mathematics does not take place in a vacuum. Collaborations among mathematicians. That's tomorrow afternoon from 4 to 6 in Ballroom A. I think this was just a tremendous way to open the meeting. I know it officially opened last night, but a lovely talk bringing together lots of different topics and beautifully illustrated. Please let's thank Dr. Despeaux.